Hegel and Bagel listeners. So this is episode 3. We're actually going to get into a text today. So grab your OJ or latte, and if you have it, I'm going to be looking at some sections of philosophy of mind. I have the translation by Wallace and Miller, and it is basically, it's the Inwood edition is how I think people would refer to it, because I think that would be the most helpful. It's sort of his introduction and commentary and revision. So it is very smoky today. It is August 2021. I almost said 2020. I just feel like 2020 is a long, extended, multi-year time. And if I sound a little sleepy, it's because I am. I deal with chronic insomnia. I'm going through a particularly bad phase. But the thing about insomnia is sometimes I can be the most focused and concentrated and productive when I am tired and not feeling well, because I'm just more likely to sit in one spot and do what I need to do. That's not always the case. Sometimes I just feel like I want to veg, but when I kind of make myself get started, get my timer, get my reading record journal out, I can usually do what I need to do. So if you haven't read, Philosophy of Mind is one of the 3 books that I'm really concentrating on right now. The other is The Sublime Objective Ideology by Slavoj Žižek, and the other one that I'm reading through, I was doing The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, but as my August book haul, I got in Anthony Kenny's A New History of Western Philosophy, which some people will compare the two, and I understand why. I might talk about that in another episode, but I'm going through that as kind of a prep for my intro to philosophy class that I'm going to be teaching at my community college in April, if it makes, because low enrollment is happening everywhere. But I did make a return to my philosophy reading groups, and so I'm going to be going over a little bit about what we talked about in there. It's a 2-hour seminar / discussion, and we just kind of go through as much as we can. We do have required reading for the class, but okay, so Philosophy of Mind, if you have ever, this is my first Hegel book, but if you are wanting to get into Hegel and you are not super familiar with Hegel, I will give a brief introduction. So he was born in the 18th century. He is in 1770, and he is kind of a entity, I was going to say symbol, but can you call a person a symbol of German idealism? He kind of has the idea that history is on this, and humanity is on this sort of progressive kind of track. Not that it's necessarily perfectly linear without any sort of dips or anything like that, but there are stages that advance. And the Philosophy of Mind is the 3rd part of his encyclopedia. So basically there are 3 parts in his encyclopedia. The first part is usually titled The Logic of Hegel. The second part is Hegel's Philosophy of Nature, and this is Philosophy of Mind. So he does start out with, and it's divided up into, this third part is divided up into 3 sections. The main section, the first section is quite lengthy. It is entitled The Subjective Mind, so that's what I'm still on. I'm on the third part of the first section. So he starts out talking about he titles it Anthropology, the Soul. So he starts out with soul because, sorry if you heard that, it was my person next across the hall from me, the dog. So the soul that he talks about is kind of a very low-level entity that is connected with nature. It's connected with being. And his book is basically, so I think I might have said this, but I'm not sure I articulated it well. He sees the same sort of progression, and he uses the same language to describe it on the micro level as on the macro level, or on the level of an individual's psychological development, and specifically focusing on the development of consciousness and mindset as the development of humanity since ancient times up to the modern age. So he really does believe that individuals and also humanity as a species evolves and grows and progresses to sort of this ideal utopic point. And, of course, it's not certain. It's not something you can necessarily predict, but it's a potential sort of path. So he starts out in the first section of The Subjective Mind in the third part of his encyclopedia. There's a lot of structure and organization here. And my phone keeps going out, and it's still recording. So he starts out talking about the soul. Then he moves on to phenomenology of the mind, where he is, talking about a lot about self-consciousness. And then psychology of the mind. And then his second section, which it's about, I think, 277 pages. So it takes over 200 pages to talk about the first section. Then the second section starts on page 220 in my edition, and it is entitled The Objective Mind, so I am not there yet. And then you have the third section, which I think is the last, it might be the last 20 pages, 20 or 30 pages, The Absolute Mind. So if you want to turn in your books, you don't have to, you can just listen. So pretty much I'm on page 154, so I'm not going to be starting. I might go back and have episodes about the first part of this text, but I thought I would just dive into what my group talked about today, since it's fresh in my mind. I am a little bit past it, but I think it's an interesting topic. So my goal is to be going over the subsection desire. So the section numbers are 426. Oh no, do I have, okay, my book is falling apart. 426, 427, 28, 29, all the way to probably 435. So, yeah. Okay, and the topics of today include three major sort of ideas. So the first is desire as the birth of the self-consciousness. The second is the two selves and how they develop and what that means for an individual life, and also on the macro level. And then the third point I want to talk about is that stood out to me is discipline as a path to higher consciousness. And I've often sort of thought of discipline or, a good work ethic as a spiritual imperative, just from my religious studies background. So I'll talk about that as well. All right, so basically, if you think about desire, we can chart this back to when we are infants. We start out, and Hegel feels that we start out in complete pure subjectivity, that we are sort of, it's also kind of like the mindfulness state, when people say that the benefits of meditation, and when you are meditating, you're quieting your mind, you're quieting your perceptions, in a sense, of the external world and also your internal world, and you are trying to adopt this state of no self, of just kind of stimuli kind of passing through you, so that you are not distracted, you are not, but if anything comes up, and there is, a part of meditation where you are, doing kind of like a body scan, and you're focusing and concentrating perhaps on the breath, but you're trying to sort of feel a unity and a oneness with the universe and where you are and your body. And in a sense, Hegel kind of sees the psychology of, a just born infant and probably a young child as being able to access that state more often than a human being, and that's why I think a lot of us, depending on the health of our childhoods and the presence or lack of trauma and abuse, some people feel that their childhood was specifically a carefree time, that they weren't self-conscious so much. We didn't think about what other people thought, that was junior high. We could just kind of live in this carefree sort of trusting, accepting state. And I'm sorry if you couldn't. But, ideally childhood perhaps is supposed to be, when people say, let them be a child, you're more in yourself than perhaps you ever will be, almost, unless you go through the dialectic that Hegel is describing, if, his theory is correct, and you pass through sort of objectivity to a renewed, enlightened sort of combination of the two, in your higher consciousness. But meditation is supposed to be a practice of higher consciousness, and kind of maybe so you can kind of look at it as going back into the subjective, the purely subjective self, but also transcending it and kind of having a higher level of subjectivity. So, but desire, which I think, quickly infiltrates our lives, and desire has a relationship with power and agency and seeing what we can control about our world, and it leads us into objectivity. And so that's why he says that desire is the birth of self-consciousness, because when I have a desire, when we have a want in the world, maybe we're hungry, or we want human connection, we want our parents to embrace us, or we want to avoid pain, or, get over the pain of, a scraped knee or something. We have something that we want. We start creeping into the individual sort of state. We see ourselves as separate from the outside world, I am different from my mother and my father and the swing set. And we're a little more conscious and a little more aware as we get into feeling desire and noting our desires and trying to satisfy our desire. We start to see ourselves as separate from, the external world. And I think that is really interesting, an interesting thing to think that, maybe before desire, having a desire, and maybe, you think, well, when do we not have a desire, right? Because we have to survive. And so our body is instinctually have needs for shelter and for food, etc. But I think that Hegel's point is that when we are so young, we don't really think about, those instincts are involuntary. And we don't really think about how food is created or brought to us. It just sort of, maybe it almost seems magical is what he's trying to describe, that food magically comes to me. Yes, I do feel a little bit of hunger, but, and yes, the babies are crying to get attention, but I think it's a learned process that what we do, our behaviors can actually affect the world. I think sometimes it's more instinctual. It's kind of like when we're sleeping and our bodies need to turn and move to relieve pressure from laying down on one side for so long. We don't really need to be conscious of it. Our bodies will just do that. And, our bodies have certain instincts that, we don't think of. We don't set the command. So there's a difference between the needs of the bodies and then desires of will. And I really should have, I have so many quotes here, and I really should have marked some quotes. I'm gonna have to plan for this a little more. So let's see. So in the book, you'll see that there's basically paragraphs that Hegel has written, and then there's the Zusatz, and then there's sometimes remarks. And so the Zusatz and the remarks are basically his students, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, and then also his ideas. I think the Zusatz might be people who are commentating or students, etc. And I think the remarks might be his own thought on his, let me see if I can find an example for myself. Or maybe the Zusatz is his ideas, and then the remarks are maybe the editor. Maybe that's inward. I don't know. But it's structured as, most of the book is commentary, either by Hegel himself or students or the actual, or Inwood, his commentary. So I don't know. I need to go back to it. So sometimes, but I just say that to say that sometimes the most illuminating parts are not necessarily Hegel's core section, but it's the remarks and the commentary, which I guess makes sense. So and it's kind of okay. Hold on, I'm just gonna go to the quote first. Okay, so here I'm reading from the Zusatz 4:26. Here in the second main part of the theory of subjective mind, Desire has as yet no further determination than that of urge, in so far as urge, without being determined by thinking, is directed on an external object in which it seeks to satisfy itself. So you can see that it's kind of the desires. We're not like very far in sort of the evolution of the self. It's sort of one-sided. And if there's any sort of, once you get what you desire and you're satisfied, there's sort of this union with the object that you want. And so it's kind of like a small resolving of it, which is what Hegel eventually wants. He wants us to move from the subjective to the completely objective, though, and then to a final sort of union. But within this, I think, sort of journey, there's little reconciliations. So actually we are going to, I'm at the 20-minute mark yet. I feel like I haven't even really gotten started, but we will pick this up in a second with the two selves and discipline as a path to higher consciousness. But basically, desire is an important part of our evolution. Okay, we're back. So we're kind of moving along in this, series of small sections to move on to the two selves. So there's not only, so you start to move to objectivity, which is filled with the stage of objectivity, unlike subjectivity, is going to be filled with conflict and relationship, because you are sort of focusing on objects and you have something to relate to other than yourself. And I say that with a grain of salt, because even saying yourself indicates that there are two. And this is where Hegel is leading to. So there's not two selves in the beginning of pure subjectivity. Only when you start easing toward objectivity, which desire is pushing you toward, are the two selves that we experience, that everyone is common to every human being. Because, you can talk to yourself as you're having a conversation. You can judge yourself. You are at war with yourself. The two selves. So Hegel actually talks about when and how and why those two selves are created of consciousness. So it says in 429, the judgment or diremption, and diremption is just a division into two, a separation, of this self-consciousness is the consciousness of a free object in which I has awareness of itself as I, but which is also outside it. So this is really interesting. This is really complicated, right? Because I remember when I was a child and I was talking with some of my friends at school, and we realized that we had voices inside our heads, in a sense. Like, can you talk to yourself? Can you create a dialogue? Do you, there was just this idea that, and if you've ever read Eckhart Tolle, or done any studies or had any conversations of mindfulness, you'll understand the terms, the ego and the watcher of the ego, or the watcher of the self. So it's like there's two sort of entities within one individual or identity. And so Hegel says that this is possible, and this is inevitable once we start to desire, because when we desire, sometimes our desires are not fulfilled. And sometimes, once we get old enough to really get more into, have a self-consciousness even, and desire gives us that self-consciousness. So once that we have it, we see that there is sort of a war or a struggle within ourselves. So for instance, I'm having insomnia and my body is me, my mind is me, if we can even think that dualistically, right? What is the mind? That's still a question that we're asking in philosophy, because if it's just the brain and it's purely mechanical, that's one thing, but is consciousness something that's physical, and is it located in the brain specifically, or is it located throughout our bodies, or so there are all these questions, and then I lost my train of thought. Consciousness. How we get to that. Okay, so it is fully a private struggle with insomnia, because my body is not sleeping and I wanted to sleep. And it's almost like, I think there are therapies that you can trick your mind in a sense to say, I'm just going to lay here, I'm not going to go to sleep, kind of reverse psychology, hoping you can trick yourself into sleeping. But what is that self that you need to trick? It's kind of complicated and mind-boggling in a sense. Think about things that you want to do, but you just can't, right? So I want to, let's say eat fewer carbs, which doesn't make sense on this podcast because it's called Hegel and Bagels. But let's say I did. I'm not really trying to do that. But let's say I wanted to, but I crave. So I want one thing, but I also crave the carbs, or crave the cookie that I shouldn't eat. Or I want to, not buy things, but yet I do it. So it feels like there are two I's. And so Hegel talks about this. And he says that in which I has awareness of itself as an I, but which is also still outside of itself. So there's not only objectivity that we come to know when we are individual human beings because of the outside world, other people and things in the outside that hurt us, and nature is an other. We ourselves have an other. So I'm going to go to section 430, where he starts to sort of use the rhetoric of combat and struggle and things like that. And I think it's also 431. So in the other as I immediately behold myself, but I also behold in it an immediately real object. Another I absolutely, they really should put quotes around this. Another I, or you can think another ego or another part of the self. Another I, absolutely independent in face of myself. So let's see. So he says that this is the second stage in the development of self-consciousness. We're caught up in desire, and we understand when our desires are unfulfilled. We start to acknowledge and be aware of, or maybe it's not even being aware of, it's that our self-consciousness creates another self-conscious. Our I creates another I. So he says, in this determination lies the massive contradiction that, since the I is what is wholly universal, absolutely pervasive, interrupted by no limit, the essence common to all men, we all call ourselves I, right? I like coffee. That's me saying it, but you will refer to yourself as an I and say, I don't like coffee. Right? So it's a very private experience that goes on with our two selves internally, but it's common to all and shared, among all people. The two selves here relating to each other constitute one identity, so to speak, one light, which is interesting. And yet they are also two selves. which subsist in complete rigidity and inflexibility toward each other, each as a reflection into self, absolutely distinct from and impenetrable by the other. So if I am trying to quiet my other I so I can get some peace, there's kind of like this war within. There's an othering that goes on externally and internally. And he says even very explicitly in 431, the process is a combat. So this is something, though, that, we are not yet in higher consciousness. And it says the two self-conscious subjects in relation to each other, since they have an immediate reality, are natural, bodily, thus exist in the manner of a thing subjected to an alien power. So that's quite true. That's interesting that he sort of phrases it like that. And I know this is the translation, so I don't know what the German is. But, because sometimes we do feel like, there's the whole, is it Socrates? I think, yes. Socratic injunction to know thyself. And if it's not, I feel like just so many people have said it, but maybe it's Socrates. So I really am embarrassed that I can't be confident about that. So how do you know yourself? Do we know ourselves well? Can we trust ourselves? When we are articulating that, it seems like there's more than one entity involved. And so, Hegel goes on in this section to talk about it on a macro level, but I think really he doesn't do a very clear job of this because he's too busy trying to clear up misunderstandings, because 432 goes into, what we need as human beings in relationship to other people. And some people have tried to see this, well, if this happens on the macro level, which he's definitely talking about the evolution of humanity, are you talking about, dueling it out and, fighting to the death or something? This combat, is the inner struggle also an external struggle? And he does talk about, and Jean-Jacques also talks about the two deaths. I think he has a chapter in the Sublime Objective Ideology called You Only Die Twice. And so the whole point of this is going to be, where it's leading up to, is that we need to find harmony within ourselves and we need to find harmony with others. And so, just like in sort of Eastern philosophy, he's saying that we have to transcend the ego, we have to transcend ourselves, we have to die to self in order to do this. And so he starts to talk about history and the master-slave connection, and that gets us into the third point, discipline as a path to higher consciousness. And he talks about this in a sense through this metaphor, but also this very historical reality of mastery and bondage. And he doesn't have to go this route, but he does. I'm going to skip ahead, though, and quote the main sort of quote in here. So it says, the habit of obedience, so this is in the middle of 435, the habit of obedience is a necessary moment in the education of every man. Without having experienced the discipline that breaks self-will, no one becomes free, rational, and capable of command. And that doesn't just mean commands from like the government or authorities. That means your ability to command yourself. Remember, there are two eyes for a while, or maybe always, who knows. I haven't read the ending of this book, so I will, let you know. Or you can let me know if you've read the whole thing. But commanding yourself, being able to be self-disciplined, being able to say, well, no, I need to change my diet to be healthier. I need to save money and stop spending it. And I need to invest in order to have more financial security and not always be freaking out. I'm really getting personal here. So it says to become free, to acquire the capacity for self-government. So there he says it right there. Self-government is what he's talking about. To a degree. All peoples must therefore undergo the severe discipline of subjection to a master. And so he is talking about this actual literal relationship. He says back on 434, the reason why, let's go to actually 435. So he says that when he's talking about the master and the bondsman, he's saying that it's the bondsman or it's the slave that's actually rising to a higher consciousness, because the master never transcends their own ego. It says, the bondsman works off his individual will and self-will in the service of the master, sublates the inner immediacy of desire, so his own desire, and in this alienation and in the fear of the master, he makes a beginning of wisdom, the transition to universal self-consciousness. So some kind of self-consciousness that is going beyond dualism and having like sort of this universal purpose. You're not just living for the self, but you are kind of living for the self, but in a universal way. And it says later, this subjugation of the bondsman egotism forms the beginning of genuine human freedom. So he, when we talked about our group, how he was maybe writing in consciousness of abolition that was happening in the U.S. Because, slavery was fought against as soon as it was, present. And then also, feeling like revolutionary fervor. So it wasn't necessarily... He's justifying it in the sense that he's justifying slavery or this kind of serfdom in a sense that there is something good that comes out of it, or that could potentially come out of it, which, we could critique all day long. But then I think that, there's still... He's not justifying it completely, because it's just that if you're trying to practice and develop your character and have self-discipline yourself, and you're not under sort of an oppressive regime in a sense, it's up to you to do it. It's up to you to be both master and slave, which, those terms, or master and bondsman, which is how it's translated here. I don't know what it is in German, which, I think is potentially problematic and toxic rhetoric. But his main point is that we need to develop the ability to self-govern. And, I think that this has a lot of validity. Maybe not necessarily as it is manifested in an actual slave-master relationship that is going to be abusive, for sure. I'm just gonna say. But, in various texts, like in the Yoga Sutras, it talks about developing a habit, doing something continuously, for a long time with enthusiasm, to be able to, have accomplishments and do things you want to do. So many things take hard work and take self-discipline and commitment, and developing a good work ethic. If you don't get the privilege of doing that as a child, you weren't instructed in these ways, and, to save money, to not just satisfy your desires instantly, instant gratification. Learning it as an adult is a little bit harder. How many people can we say in our world today are good at being disciplined? That's why there are all these businesses that say we can help you be more disciplined and accountable, because it's hard to do it ourselves. But in a way, if we want to accomplish anything, whether that's being financially secure, being successful in education, in college and graduate school, getting a job, getting to where we want to be in life, that takes discipline. And that's in, 18th century, 19th century German philosophy and Hegel, and it's in the Yoga Sutras, it's in, ancient Hindu religion, it's even in, it's in Christianity, it's in Judaism, the idea that you're working towards something and then you'll be rewarded at the end. It's, and it's in the Quran, it's in, I don't want to leave any religions out, it's in all the religions I've studied. And so I think that's really interesting. Hegel to me is very in alignment. He does have some elitist views. He does have views of privilege. He does, the whole idea of progression and a hierarchy and order, etc., can be critiqued and is critiqued, especially in my discipline, women's studies. But he has, some spiritual aspects to him. And I guess, that's what German idealism is, it's focusing on the spiritual. And what was I going to say? Really quickly as we're ending up. I just see a lot of correlation between what he is talking about and what sometimes, when he's talking about the mind and the consciousness and, getting to a higher consciousness, that's very popular in the New Age thought. But it's in Buddhism, and it's in Hinduism, it's in the Eastern religions and spirituality. And it's, I always see a connection between Eckhart Tolle and him and Hegel when he's talking about the ego. So he's a little bit of a mystic, even in his, somewhat elitist and racist ways, I have to say, because the anthropology of the soul, especially the first part, he talks a little too generally about different cultures. So I feel like there's just a part of it that the modern reader wants to completely take out, like when he, says that the Germans are, this way and the French are this way, and he just kind of takes a whole culture and tries to define it. I'm sure very fascinating, though, for people in the, late 1700s, early 1800s who maybe couldn't travel or didn't travel. So anyway, those are my thoughts today on Hegel and desire. I hope that they were interesting. Obviously, I'm just reading this for the first time and talking to people about this for the first time. So maybe, a conversation can be had with those of you who have, read different works of Hegel and read The Philosophy of Mind a couple of times and, know German. But I really appreciate getting the opportunity to just talk through this as well, because I feel like it helps me learn. And thank you for listening. Send me messages, send me comments, and we'll come back next time, maybe with more Hegel or maybe on Jean-Jacques.